Okay, so I think we should probably get started, and I would just like to thank you all very much for coming on this slightly sticky evening. It's very much appreciated, and particularly thanks to our two speakers who've also come all the way from Brussels and London to come and talk to us about their experience in public policy making this evening. So what I was hoping we could do is, first of all, I just wanted to have a kind of introductory conversation with both Liz and Rod about their experience and how they've come to their current positions. So how you've ended up in the position that you have now, what drove you, what motivated you, and so on, so we can get a flavour of where they are now. Before they talk through, Liz first, then followed by Rod, some case examples of how they've done their work in public policy and how advocacy has worked in their case, so that we can have some kind of common reflections on how advocacy works in different policy making environments, which is the purpose of the session today. But before I do that, I'm going to introduce myself. I've obviously introduced myself to a couple of people going around. So my name is Dr. Emma Carmel, and I, with a number of colleagues across the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, have been busy developing this orange-coloured master's programme, which there's some information in on your tables. And we're running a number of different events to try and illustrate the kinds of things that we want to be talking about as part of our master's programme. It's a distance learning programme, so there's residential and online elements. People that are expected to be able to do it while they're working full-time. And we really want to bridge the gap between academic research and understanding of policy making and the practice of policy making. We'll see how that works. But if anybody is interested in following up with any questions about the Masters, then please do. But the main purpose is to hear from Rod and Liz today about their experience. So as Liz is going to be starting off with the talk, I'm going to start with Rod. And I was just wondering if you have had quite a varied career, so you haven't always been in a kind of NGO advocacy role, and I was just wondering, can you explain a little bit about your wider background and how you made that move?
I think most of my career is as a civil servant, a central government civil servant. So out of university, I went into the civil service. Really pretty much all my career in social policy departments. So for much of my early career, I was in social security, did a range of different things, including frontline management, but also finance and policy jobs. And indeed working as a private secretary. So I was private secretary to Alistair Darling when he was Secretary of State for social security. I had a spell in the Ministry of Justice, then found myself running the government in-house training organisation, the National School of Government, and when the coalition government came in, they kind of decided they wanted to close that down as part of austerity, so I closed that down. At that point, I was feeling a little bit, I have to say, disenchanted with central government and central government decision making, and so I was keen to kind of look around for something that I felt I really wanted to do, and found this opportunity with Prisoners Education Trust, which is a charity, small charity working in prisoner education, and thought, yeah, that's great. And so I've been there over 5 years now, and absolutely enjoyed the experience. But it's an experience that's informed by having worked on the policy side of central government, as well as a kind of an operational experience.
Thanks, Rod. I think that's really interesting. I think we're going to find quite a lot of commonalities around this question of wanting to make a difference. So work in the NGO and advocacy sector tends to be driven by that kind of desire for change, for making a difference.
And I think it's very interesting that that's also very often the reason why people go into government as well. I mean, you want to go in to be a civil servant because you think, what better place to actually be able to influence the way kind of decisions about the deployment of all government's resources, social issues are addressed, and so on. It's not as simple as that, and I think the intrinsic rewards of working in an organisation where it is clearer about the purpose and sometimes less conflicted in the way that central government decision making can be very involved is one of the lessons I would draw from my career. Although I've enjoyed most parts of it, and some of them, absolutely, fantastic.
Great, thanks very much. So Liz has a very contrasting role and a contrasting biography, I would say. So
I think completely different. Yeah, thank you for the invite. Hi everyone. So already, my name's Liz Gove. Gove is Old French, Gome. If there's any French here, I don't know. But I'm from a multicultural background. I feel very much at home in Brussels, and I studied in Durham, did a combined arts, but then decided to change pathways and did a Euro Masters at Bath University. So European Affairs, Public Policy, Law, and that's where Dr. Carmel gave me the theory, if you like, and gave me, let's say, her course in EU social policy triggered my interest in social matters and this drive you talk about, wanting to change things. And so I went back to Brussels and dabbled in civil service, quickly left. It's quite a world, the European Civil Service. Around the European Civil Service, there is a huge number of European organisations, networks, advocacy organisations, representing all types of interest you can possibly imagine. The Brussels bubble is like any capital, like any bubble in any country. And I've been working in 15 years now in the Brussels bubble, advocating, using my EU social policy knowledge to advocate, first of all, for the interest of the homeless sector. They are organised collectively in a European lobby. St Mungo's, Crisis, Shelter, all of these advocate collectively at Brussels level. I did that for 12 years, so really focused on homeless and housing policy. And then shifted to management 2 years ago. I now manage a network of family organisations, all types of families without discrimination, across 23 countries. So we're a Brussels-based office. I manage the Brussels-based office, but we have a foot in 23 countries, so it's a bit multinational type, multi-level governance. And I advocate for families in a spirit of non-discrimination, social inclusion, solidarity, human rights at Brussels level. I've been doing that for 2 years now, and I'll give you a bit more of insight into what I do on a daily basis in a bit. Yeah.
Great.
So there you go.
I was quite intrigued by that idea of dabbling with the EU civil service and then moving. What was the key thing that made the move?
No, but it was very simple. It was internships. So in the European Parliament, in the Commission, and in the European NGO sector. And I tried out all three. I saw those worlds from inside. And it's true, you want to change the world when you're in the civil service, and you think that it's a good place to start. But I don't know how it works in the national civil service, but in the European civil service, hierarchy tends to stifle any kind of, how can I say, a drive that might come on the operational level. I'm not a very patient person by nature, so it just didn't fit who I was. In the NGO world, it's a tough world. NGOs are in survival mode half the time, trying to get funding, advocate for sometimes very difficult groups, but it just suits my personality more, and you have that flexibility that you don't necessarily have in a certain, government-based straitjacket, and that's just a fact. So freedom, but it comes with a cost. So
great. Thank you both very much for that introduction. That's given me a great taster for what I know that you're both going to talk about. So I'm really delighted to have Liz give us a short talk about some of her successes, mostly, I think, as an advocate and NGO director in Brussels. Liz is going to speak for around 15 minutes, and then Rod is going to speak for around 15 minutes, and then we'll open up. We've got lots of time for questions and discussion, either to the individual speakers or across the piece, yeah, what we have in common. So Liz, please.
Okay, is this mic on? Yeah?
I think so.
All good? Just to get an idea of who I'm talking to, is everyone British here? Yes? No? Who's British?
No.
Just a show of hands. Wow, okay. Who's from another European Union country? Okay, which one?
Italy.
Italy, okay.
Romania.
Romania, okay. Have any of you ever been to Brussels or had some sort of experience of what's going on in European affairs? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah? What? Holiday doesn't count. No. Okay. And are any of you working for NGOs today or have experience of non-profit voluntary sector? Okay. One? And okay. Yeah. Okay.
My neighbour works in co-housing.
Okay. Well, that counts, I guess.
She's in Spain, so I'll tell her that.
Okay, fine. And so, are people working in local authorities as well, or no? Studying?
Mostly studying, I think.
Areas of
Studied,
interest?
Retired. All
Social
sorts.
policy, consumer, sustainability. I heard sustainability earlier on. Sustainability. What are other? Yeah. Other topics that you?
Labour markets.
Labour market. Mm-hmm. Other specialist areas?
International relations generally.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
FDI.
Sorry.
Foreign direct investments.
Sorry.
Foreign direct investments.
What's that?
Foreign direct investments.
Okay, right. I'm not too familiar with that area. Okay, thank you. Right. Well, I'm going to, in 15 minutes, just give you some sort of a flavour of the way European NGOs shape policy at European level, in a nutshell. So I'm director of CoFACE Families Europe. I say CoFACE because it's the French way, but CoFACE, CoFACE, I don't know, whatever works, you know. But Families Europe, so a pluralistic organisation. I've already explained more or less what we do. We advocate for the rights and interests of all types of families. We monitor European initiatives, build the capacity of our network to address European challenges coming their way, but also to harness European opportunities. And we're funded under a European programme for employment and social innovation. Public policy at European level, probably quite similar to national and local dynamics. Especially the national dynamics, it depends on the competence of the European Union. In some areas, the European Union has competence to legislate and to really harmonise across the 28 countries, soon 27. And in other areas, it can't. It simply can't. It has to respect what they call subsidiarity principle, and it has to just support, drive reform, show leadership, promote transnational exchange, etc. This is soft law. So we have a mix of soft law and hard law used in Brussels. The soft law can be anything from what we call communications, guidelines, frameworks, recommendations, opinions. I've even seen non-papers in my time. Principles, staff working documents, all these kind of things. And hard law, well, it's legislation. Law is law. NGO policy tools, well, in order to shape that policy arena, shape that thinking, we use similar tools. Charters, principles, briefs, position papers. We interpret Eurospeak. So in fact, the 5 case studies I'm going to look at now are probably going to seem a bit Eurospeak-ish to you. I apologise for that, and I'll try to clarify if you have any questions and things like that. We bridge policy sectors, we take part in high-level advisory groups that advise the European Commission, different ways in which we shape policy. NGOs matter. In Brussels, we called different things: civil society, European networks, non-profits, And these are 5 examples, but there are countless, and maybe with your different areas, because sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goals is a massive thing in Brussels as well, let's be clear. But first example is the European Pillar of Social Rights. Have you ever heard of that? Have you heard? No, of course not. It's very, very Brussels-based. Well, it's kind of a first. It was proclaimed in November last year by Commission, Council and Parliament together. And it sort of gives a social policy agenda for Europe, which was quite needed. We had a bit of a vacuum for about 10 years, where we lacked any ambition, any vision for social policy at European level. So this is a new vision, if you like, with long-term goals around 20 principles. You've got principles on gender equality, inclusion of persons with disabilities, on childcare, long-term care, housing, you name it. A number of principles linked to social and employment policy. So it's really the European Commission's latest major initiative in the field of employment and social affairs. So if you work on the labour market, well, yeah, it's quite an important framework these days. The thing is, it's very much set in an economic policy framework. So it says social rights, but it's a kind of tool to reinforce and to support an economic policy mechanism, which is the European Economic and Monetary Union. So there's some confusion and different ways of perceiving this. Is it social? Is it economic? Is it labour market? What is it? But it's developing, slowly but surely. And NGOs are quite important in this respect because this is a piece of soft law. It's not legislation. It's guidance to support member states, to help them invest appropriately in different areas. And we have to be there to keep it social and not just economic. I mean, they're both sides of the same coin. Completely appreciate that. But there are lots of different interests in Brussels, and we just need to be there to make sure everything is balanced. So for us, it's very much, when I say us, there's about 40, 50, 60 European social NGOs, and we're one of them. So we collectively advocate to make sure the social pillar stays very social. We keep pressure on the European Commission for delivery. So now they've adopted it, now what? And we have to be around the table to make sure it will actually deliver. Because if we don't, well, we're not too sure what will happen to this pillar of social rights. And this was promoted by President Juncker. I don't know if you've heard of him. If you have, okay, he's in the media quite a bit. He has his provocative approach to things. Well, it's a first because usually these kind of policies are promoted by the Social Affairs Commissioner. This is an exception. The Pillar of Social Rights is presented, has been pushed, has been driven by the actual President of the Commission, Juncker. So here you see what he said in his State of the Union address. We have to step up the work for a fair and truly pan-European labour market. As part of these efforts, I will want to develop a European Pillar of Social Rights which takes account of the changing realities of Europe's societies in the world of work, and which can serve as a compass for the renewed convergence within the Euro area. Quite economic. But we're there to try and make it more relevant for social protection, social welfare as well. And the first deliverable of this Pillar of Social Rights, which was published with the package, is what they call in Brussels the WorkLife Balance package. Now this is a package, a mix of soft law and hard law. So this is the second case study. The first case study is pure soft law, guiding principles, no competence of the European Union really, but a little, so it depends. So in each principle, we're hoping the Commission will publish a package of measures. And one of the principles is on work-life balance, and this is the first package. So we have a communication, which is a piece of, well, it's a guidance note, which is accompanied by a directive, which is a piece of legislation proposed by the European Commission. The policy objectives of that package and that directive are to increase women's employment and to reduce the gender care gap. The directive includes proposals to increase rights to paternity, parental, carers leaves and flexible work arrangements. For us, Families Europe, we've been advocating for, well, since 2012 now, to push this top of the European agenda. 2017, 5 years later, the European Commission delivers a package. We have been active in trying to shape policy at European level. We've been drawing attention to the needs of families. There's been a mix of scientific evidence, a mix of evidence coming from the civil society sector, and that's culminated in this package. And why does my organisation work on work-life balance? Because it's possibly one of the biggest challenges for families in the 21st century. Many households have no choice. We need to have two incomes. There's wage stagnation. What do you do when both, if you're in a couple, both have to work? You have to make choices, and we need both certain rights on the social and employment side, and we need employers to be understanding of the need to come in and out of the labour market. And it's not only to make babies, it's because we have an ageing population as well. So this package is for working parents and for working carers. And we sort of play an essential role in shoring up support for the directive and driving implementation of the non-legislative recommendations, which are the European structural funds, which is a pot of money redistributed amongst the countries, need to invest in childcare, need to invest in long-term care, need to invest in promoting women's employment, etc. On the legislative side, the directive is extremely controversial. It was published, we were together in Brussels, I think, last year. It was published about a year ago. And there are still huge discussions in Council, which is the body bringing together 28 governments. So the European Parliament now has to position itself on this directive, and its discussions are ongoing, and the Council also has to position itself. Well, things are blocking a bit in Council. And this is problematic for us. And so we are activating our national branches to talk to government, especially the governments which are not hugely in favour of this directive. So this is why I've been extremely busy for the past 10 days, because I've been in Paris, because France is quite crucial in the equation. Two big countries, Germany and France. They can make or break the directive, especially in social Europe. In the social Europe field. Another case study, the European Accessibility Act. The Commission proposed a directive last year, no, was it 2 years ago, with the policy objective to improve functioning of the internal market for accessible products and services by removing barriers to accessibility. And that concerns all kinds of products. Can you see okay? It's pretty small. Digital products, e-commerce, e-books, banking services. This is a piece of internal market legislation which has a social impact, because this can really open up a whole world for people with reduced mobility, reduced visibility. So our sister NGOs, the European Disability Forum and Age Platform Europe, representing older people in the Brussels policy arena, are driving advocacy to support this directive. And we're behind them 100%, because a big part of the constituency I represent is families of people with disabilities. So this is a piece of hard law, which again goes through the same process as the Work-Life Balance Directive. European Parliament and Commission are positioning themselves, and there's no real, European Parliament and Council are positioning themselves, and once they reach a position, they have reached a position, now they're in a phase of trilogues, negotiating the final deal between Commission, Council and Parliament. And they will reach a deal, and that's extremely positive, and that means hopefully important social impact for persons with disabilities and older people. Now, there's no real official channel for NGOs to get involved in this legislative process. We kind of have to improvise a lot, try to get access to information, work with members of the European Parliament, where possible with council, if we have strong links with government. It's a bit of a complex process. It's not ideal, but it's part of a political game, if you like. But this isn't, it's an example of hard law which we definitely support. Another piece of hard law.
Yes.
2 minutes, right. The budget, money. Yeah. So there's a 7-year budget that's always adopted, and now the negotiations have started for the next 7-year budget at the European level. And context is difficult. It's Brexit. There's anti-European sentiment in lots of countries. So we actually dub these the Hunger Games. It's really everybody is trying to get a piece of the budget, and NGOs are advocating for their constituencies, and so there's no official channel, but we are there around the table working with Commission, European Parliament and Council and governments to ensure the budget is used well. For instance, my organisation doesn't believe in building more institutions, social and healthcare institutions. We believe that community-based solutions are absolutely possible and desirable, and we want the EU budget to be a driver of that systems change with conditionalities. One example of something we're advocating for within the financial budget. Last thing, soft law. There are many of these around. This one is called Alliance to Better Protect Minors Online. Typical Eurospeak. Even myself, I have trouble with that. But it's an alliance, it's a high-level group with representatives of the digital industry, consumers, families, some researchers, and we're members of that to keep the pressure on, to make sure industry continues committing. Self-regulation is soft law, by definition. We advocate for a mix of self-regulation, regulation and education. But we need to be in there. We put forward specific proposals. Some are taken to the next level, some are ignored, but we keep the pressure on. And this is an official channel where we get to voice our concerns as consumers, as users, as digital citizens. So, we also recently published, and this is an example of a policy tool, because we're getting a bit worried, the social impact of digitalisation is under-researched. And it's taking over at the moment in terms of work, in terms of consuming, in terms of socialising, and what we saw with the Cambridge Analytica scandal. New technology is not always serving the general interest, and this is something we advocate for quite strongly. And so we adopted these principles just a month ago, and I don't know what we're going to do next, but we're going to plan carefully on how to use these as a basis to advocate for good policy, and new technological developments that serve the interest, the general interest. So, just some examples of different policy areas that we work in. Happy to answer any questions after, or give other examples from other fields. I don't know.
That's great.
Yeah?
Okay.
Okay.
Many thanks, Liz. And one complex bureaucratic policy-making environment to a very different kind, I think. So.
Shall I move this?
Oh yes, please. Thank you. Do you want to slap the slides through?
Right. Well, good evening. I'm from Prisoners Education Trust, and just to give you a bit of background on what we are, we're a charity that's been running now for almost 30 years, and the main thing that we do is that we fund prisoners in England and Wales to study distance learning courses that in subjects and at levels that wouldn't be otherwise available through mainstream education. And last year we funded just over 3,000 prisoners to study various things, and that's right up to degree level, but also vocational courses, something really quite simple. But one thing we've learnt over those 30 years, particularly when you're working with a prison system, which is absolutely dominated by central government policy, you can't move an inch in that sector without working with the way the system is controlled and run. But one thing we discovered is that actually we also need to work to influence policy and practice in the way that prison education as a whole works. I mean, what we believe is that every prisoner should be a learner and every prison a place to learn. And to do that, it's not just about sending in the courses, it's also about actually working the way the system supports them to achieve learning objectives. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk you through a story about some things that we've been doing over the last few years. And then I'm going to finish up by trying to draw some conclusions and draw some lessons from that, about how policy influencing perhaps can be made to work. So, but first of all, just some basics of information about the prison education. So there are around 120 prisons in England and Wales. The prison population goes up and down a bit, but it's around 86,000. It's 95% male. Of that population, 42% report having been permanently excluded from school. Around a third report having some kind of learning difficulty or disability. Something like half come to prison saying that they have no qualifications. And they leave prison and they go on to reoffend in high numbers, the overall percentage being around 50%. That's much higher for the younger age groups and for the shorter term prisoner population. And they struggle to get jobs as well. After about a year, maybe about 25% of prisoners having left prison get employment. And education is known to make a significant difference to this. There's some very important work that RAND did in the States, a very large meta-analysis showing the value of prison education in addressing things like reoffending and employment. In the UK, the Ministry of Justice published last year a report that looked at the learning records of prisoners and what happened to them when they went on after release, whether on the police national computer they were picked up as reoffending. And what it showed is that the prisoners that engaged in education went on to reoffend significantly less than those that didn't. And just from our own point of view at Prisoners Education Trust, we've done research with the Ministry of Justice statisticians, which has shown that the prisoners that we support go on to reoffend after release over a quarter less than a matched control group that the Ministry of Justice put together of prisoners with similar characteristics, age, nature of offence, propensity to reoffend, and so on. The other thing to note is that prison education is not really that great. It's inspected by Ofsted that inspects all the other education in this country, and there's kind of a pecking order in which you have schools that kind of do really quite well, then you move on to sort of sixth form colleges and they do rather worse. But bottom of the pecking order is prisons in terms of the numbers of prisons where the education is reckoned to be good or even satisfactory. So you have a policy challenge. Prisons are incredibly expensive. I mean, the statistics that's often used is £36,000 a year to keep someone in prison. It's cheaper to send them to Eton. I'm not sure if that's actually true, but that's the kind of thing that gets said. And so expensive that for the government that looks unaffordable in an age of austerity, which what you're doing is cutting expenditure in every opportunity you can. That is a real problem. You're spending that much money. And it's ineffective. Those reoffending rates, it doesn't appear to do it doesn't appear to work. It doesn't work very well. Now I'm going to talk you through the sort of policy response to this, and I'm going to start with the first Secretary of State I'm going to introduce, who's Chris Grayling, who's the gentleman on the right of the picture below. Now his response was to save money. So he cut prison budgets, and in particular he cut the staffing levels drastically within prisons. He privatised the probation service. That's the organisation that works to kind of take people as they leave prison. And he introduced something which has been known as the book ban. So he didn't actually ban books in prisons, but what he did do was introduce and refuse to change rules that made it very, very difficult for prisoners to get books or to be sent books while they were in prison. Now, the prison education budgets themselves, as it happened at this time, weren't the responsibility of the Ministry of Justice. They were the responsibility of the Department for Business because it was sort of connected with the universities. And actually, they did not a bad job of protecting the spend on prison education. But it was a really, really difficult climate to work in. So, what did we do? I see that one of the things from that has disappeared, but I've got a copy of it to show you. Well, what we did, and I can't claim credit to this because this all started before I joined the organisation, but what we did do is get together with other voluntary and community sector organisations that were interested in prison education, with a view to kind of creating a common voice on this issue. And crucially, one thing that we did do is we said that a vital part of the way we were going to work would be to listen to service users. We were going to listen to prisoners themselves as what they were saying about prison education. And we asked ourselves, well, what does good prison education actually look like? And here's a report that we produced back in 2013, which actually was our analysis of what could be done to make prison education work a whole lot better than it was working at the moment. And finally, what we also did was we recognised that actually this wasn't getting a great deal of traction. We had thought out what the right answer was, but not a lot was happening. But we looked ahead to the 2015 election that was coming up. Now, what we knew was that, well, at an election you can expect there to be some changes in government. And you'd know that there'd be a new bunch of ministers that would be coming in and they'd be given a whole lot of briefing on things that they were supposed to think about when they take up their ministerial post. And we knew that one of the issues that they were going to have to address was the fact that the education contracts in prison were due to expire very shortly, and that therefore ministers would need to take some decisions about what they wanted to do around those contracts. And so what we did is we worked on a document in time for the election, so it was ready to be given to ministers the moment they arrived, saying, actually, we've got the answer to this. We've worked out what needs to be done. Because of the time frame, there's no way you're going to not extend the contracts, but you should extend it with some variations. And we told them the sorts of things they should be changing within the contracts. And we worked actually with the 4 organisations that held those contracts to get them signed up to what we were suggesting as well, because they were as unsatisfied with the constraints within the contract that they were working with as we were. So there's some real possibility of presenting some answers to that. Oh, it's that. There it is. There's the report. Just suddenly arrived at the last minute. Okay. So, after the election, 2015, we have a new policy direction because we have a new Secretary of State. So it is now Michael Gove, who's the gentleman on the left of the picture that you can see there. Now, Michael Gove arrived with a mindset which was looking for an education solution. He'd made most of his political career as an education secretary and talking in opposition and in government about education. He was switched on to the idea of education being an answer. Fantastic. Very interestingly, he publicly repudiated the policy around access to books within prisons of his predecessor. Even though same political party and the two of them kind of were quite happy to share political platforms for other reasons, he publicly went out to say that he disagreed with that policy, which was interesting because actually it had been overturned in judicial review anyway, so he didn't really need to do it. It was a piece of political positioning that he did that. Now, he actually read our briefing. I know he read our briefing because I was at a meeting with him and I could see that he'd been underlining bits and looking at it. which is quite, I mean, it's quite an achievement that he actually focused on something which we thought was probably going to be way down the list of his priorities, but he actually looks at it. And partly as a result, he delivered his first speech on prison policy from a platform that the Prisoner Learning Alliance that we had put together actually fronted up. So it was behind, you know how politicians deliver these speeches, and there's always some think tank's kind of banner or something behind them. Well, it was ours on this occasion that we got him to do that. And he commissioned a review of prison education, and he put an expert panel in place to support that review, and I was on that panel. And the review confirmed pretty much the policy recommendations entirely that we had been making. It was interesting that the last recommendation, lots of these recommendations were around flexibilities in the contract, but one of the recommendations we made was around, the last one was about leadership. And we made the point that in a prison, actually, the governor has got to take ownership of anything that goes on in a prison, because otherwise it just doesn't happen, and that therefore the governor needed to take ownership of prison education. Now, we didn't kind of quite see it that way at the time when we wrote it, but actually that chimed in extremely well with Michael Gove's views about the role of head teachers in taking charge of their schools, and the reforms that he'd made in the education sector, in which it was all about freeing up head teachers to really get a grip on what's happening in their schools and taking more control. The person he got in to lead the review was a so-called super head of a school, Dame Sally Coates. She did an excellent job, and what she decided was actually pretty much in line with our recommendations, which I say is not surprising. You don't have to go around and talk to many people in prison, teachers or prisoners, to discover the things that are wrong with the way prison education works, and it's quite obvious to suggest some of the solutions that need to be put in place. But she made recommendations, all of which were accepted by the government. Interestingly, this was the time when Michael Gove was probably the most powerful that he ever was in government, because the referendum was coming up, and the Prime Minister and the Chancellor were desperate to try and keep him on side so he wouldn't back the Leave campaign. And so it's no coincidence, I think, that this was also a time when you actually had a Prime Minister making a speech about prison education, which is unheard of, I think, generally for a Conservative politician. But I'm afraid there was the referendum campaign. That was then a new Justice Secretary. But that new Justice Secretary, having had a report produced which was accepted in full by the government of the day, partly because of that political power that Michael Gove had, actually that was now embedded. And the new Justice Secretary, Liz Truss, continued that direction of travel. And those reforms are being implemented. Now, they're not being implemented in the full-blooded way that they would have been, I think, if Michael Gove had stayed, but the momentum set up for the officials of having this all now endorsed as official policy, and the fact that the officials themselves were involved in some of that decision-making as part of the expert panel, means that there's actually quite a lot of consensus to get on in making that work. And they are continuing to talk to us. So we have a policy forum with the Ministry of Justice officials that are working on the implementation of the policy that is still meeting, and which gives us an opportunity to engage on all this. So what are my reflections from all this about what this might suggest about how, as a charity, as a voluntary community sector organisation, you might influence government? I think there is something about having an independent voice that is really important. That you need to have the courage of your values and your convictions to say what you believe in and what you want to see happen. But that you also actually need to know enough about the system, be enough within the system to understand it, to make a credible contribution. And actually the voluntary community sector can be extremely valuable in that respect. One thing that you learn, particularly around the British civil service, is just how swiftly everybody moves on from job to job. Generally speaking, with a few kind of kind of exceptions, the voluntary community sector know more about how things really work in an area like prison education than the central government officials that work on it. The VCS, unlike the officials within the system, can tell it like it is. You are in a position in which you can say, this really isn't working. I know there's a line to take, but it really isn't working. I think it is worth collaborating across the sector to build that platform, to get other people involved, as long as you're all kind of coming together around some shared values and some shared commitment. I think there is some real value in asking yourself what actually are the right answers, what are we working towards, and thinking that through, and doing that without necessarily waiting to be asked, because I mean you could wait forever, no one, and then you miss your opportunity. And the evidence really is important, so garnering the research is important. Actually garnering that kind of case study type research, particularly from service users themselves in a prison context, in other words from prisoners and ex-prisoners, can be really, really powerful and give a real weight to what you're saying that speaks far more to most audiences than the statistics, which are also important. I think it's really valuable to recognise that whatever the constraints, both officials and politicians do want to solve problems. Now, some of the problems they want to solve are ones like, how do I get re-elected? And why am I so unpopular, or whatever. But by and large, there's also a very large overlap in the problems that they see, the social problems, the social difficulties, the challenges in society that the VCS, the voluntary community sector, also want to see addressed. So actually there is a large kind of overlap of trying to achieve the right solution. Now the constraints on the politicians may be quite different from the solutions that the VCS would like to offer, but there's a basis for working together. It is important that you see the problem from the point of view of the ministers and the politicians that are working with the issues, and that you try and offer solutions. I think one of the most powerful definitions I know of what power is that power is something that you're awarded if you can solve people's problems. So that within a system, I mean, for example, within a prison wing, the power isn't necessarily the person with the black and white uniform and the keys. It's the prisoner that can sort out the other prisoners if the prison officers are having a problem with that individual. And that can be a real problem in something like a prison context. But it's the way that real power operates, not necessarily the trappings. And if you can solve politicians' problems, actually you get the power and influence that goes with that, if you can be part of the solution. Being ready for opportunities really matters. I mean, we weren't going to get anywhere with this agenda, frankly, with Chris Grayling. But suddenly we had an opportunity, we made huge progress. The climate is probably, the circus has moved on, the climate is now probably more difficult again. But nevertheless, we've made some real progress, and it is some progress that I think we can hang on to. It's something that the VCS can do, is offer that external support and endorsement. Now you've got to be very careful about that, because if one of your problems is I'm not popular, actually associate with us and we can make you a little bit more popular. But there's a kind of deal in that. You've got to be giving the messages that we want you to be giving if we're going to be supporting what you're saying. And there are some very basic things like, strangely enough, that even though they're in contact with so many prisoners, the government finds it really quite difficult to get prisoners to go out on the platform and say something positive about what's going on within the prison system. Actually, the voluntary and community sector, with its relationship with prisoners and ex-prisoners, is in a much stronger position to do some of that. And the last is just stick at it. And you do need to stick at it. You've got to be in there for the long haul, believing in what you believe in, and looking for those opportunities to carry on bringing that message to bear. So at the bottom, you've got a sort of rogues gallery of the Justice Secretaries that there have been over the last few years. I've concentrated really on the first two, but it just shows how the political circus kind of moves on. And actually, as a voluntary community sector organisation advocating some policy solutions, we need to stick with it.
Thanks very much, Rod. I mean, if I can just draw to a close, we can all go and get some refreshment and some drink. Sue picked up on and made a problem out of my suggestion that there might be some similarities between your experiences, but I'm just going to offer a few. So one of the ones is you've both talked a lot about values and the importance of values and driving this vision. So the question of one's impact, it seems to me, is something that is really about keeping hold of that vision for the long term, and both of you have talked about that a lot, that the determination to stick with what you're at is also about knowing what it is that you're aiming for, and that seems to be really important for policy, and that's something that applies no matter where you're working. How that plays out in practice looks very different from different places. But there was also something you both talked about, collaboration, a lot about collaboration. You know, when you talked about your successes, you talked about working with other organisations, finding places where you can make those values work together, and that's when it works best. And using lots of different channels. So Liz, you talked a lot about the official and the unofficial, but you talked about, you know, there's a commission, and then there's a paper, and there's a review, and there's a meeting with the minister. So at every forum, policy in a sense is being made, it's being practiced, it's being worked up. It can't be measured, the impact can't be seen immediately, but somehow those kinds of ideas are changing, which of course leads back to this question of discourse. But most of all, I don't know what anyone else thinks, but I'm just left with the idea of, boy, it's hard work, really hard work. And all I can say is thank you very much to both of you, both for coming here this evening, but also for the other work that you've been doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you.